Alright, so hey everyone, today I want to take a look at the Deadzones for Halo Combat Evolved on the original Xbox. So starting with the camera, we have about a 26 or 27% square or axial dead zone. So that means you have to move the stick further diagonally before you start seeing any movement occur. 26% is a pretty common dead zone size, but it is large. You can see how much stick motion you can make without anything occurring in-game. Axial dead zones restrict diagonal movement around the axes, and the amount of which depends on the size. So at 26%, this is quite a bit. You can see that I can make rather large bobbing motions or point at very obvious angles, and the cursor will move perfectly horizontally in this case. It isn't until you break into these green regions or past both the axial dead zones where you start seeing diagonal movement occur. This is more obvious when looking straight up or down and looking for horizontal movement, which would be diagonal movement if it wasn't capped like this. This of course isn't great because that means your stick angles aren't accurate to your cursor angles. So if I make a movement like this, I'm moving perfectly up and then perfectly left, even though these are pretty obvious angles. And all the diagonals you do have access to are rescaled between or past both axial dead zones. The acceleration curve looks pretty exponential. This actually seems to be pretty similar to the curves I've tested in the Master Chief Collection, but given the different points, I was able to test at a 0% dead zone there versus at the default dead zone here. So the curves looks a little more like a linear piecewise in the Master Chief Collection, whereas here it's looks a little more smooth. So that's just, you know, different points. But as you can see, the further I push the stick, the faster it goes, and the faster it builds up. And at about 90%, it jumps pretty dramatically, about 3 times increase. And this isn't the outer dead zone, so if you push further, you get more speed. The threshold is perfectly straight within this axial dead zone, but in this diagonal threshold, it actually pinches inward. And it goes a little past 45 degrees for this tail end right here. Halo Combat Evolved only has a horizontal turn acceleration threshold. In Halo 2 and onward, they'll add a vertical acceleration threshold that functions exactly the same. The shape of this threshold is a pretty big issue, and it's actually not just the threshold, but it just seems like diagonal acceleration in general is sort of scaled so that it makes kind of a clover shape, and this can make diagonal acceleration both feel more sensitive as well as inconsistent. So if you're making angular adjustments, it can just not feel particularly smooth. And certainly a big part of that will be the axial dead zone restricting diagonal movement. But making movements like this will feel irregular since you're changing speeds pretty dramatically. And if making large circles, you can bleed over into these inward points and have even more dramatic inconsistencies because of that. This is actually, this diagonal acceleration is what's known as classic aiming in the Master Chief Collection. And if you set it to modern, it actually corrects the diagonal acceleration and the acceleration threshold so that it's perfectly circular, which corrects this and makes diagonal movement feel far more consistent. Next is the vertical acceleration seems to be slower than the horizontal acceleration, and that's ignoring this jump in this turn acceleration. So if you move at say 60% horizontally, this is faster than moving 60% vertically. And at least at these points, it seems like vertical movements are about half the speed of horizontal ones. And aside from just making a vertical movement slower, this actually affects your diagonal movement by skewing the vector horizontally. So the angle your cursor is moving at will be skewed horizontally. So if I try moving at a 45-degree angle, you might be able to see that it's more flat than you'd expect. And this effect is similar for the turn acceleration. This turn acceleration only seems to apply to the horizontal axis, so that also skews your diagonal movement more horizontally. So we have the axial dead zone restricting how much of the stick is allowed to output diagonal movement, and the diagonals you do have are skewed horizontally, both from the lower vertical sensitivity and the accelerated horizontal acceleration. Movement, the dead zone is about 35% and mostly squarish. You can see in the corners it's sort of pinched in, and it's a little too difficult to really show in this video, but it does follow the same sort of inward spike diagonally that the camera acceleration uses. For diagonal movement, it's the same restriction as the camera. So you can see that within these axial regions, in this case I'm moving perfectly forward and back. It isn't until I break out of both axis dead zones where you start seeing diagonal movement begin occurring. I didn't test this, so it's not demonstrated on the graph, but you can crouch in this game. And you can crouch as long as you're moving under a certain speed. So as you can see, once I move the stick further, it forces me to begin stand up to walk. And you can see that it's very close to the edge of the stick threshold. And if we move over here, we can see that the threshold is earlier, and over here I have to basically move outside of the graph before that begins. So you can see that it's the same inward point for diagonal movement as the camera. Of course, you don't need too much precision for movement, but it does carry the same issues as camera movement for the most part. And Halo is known for its controls in console shooters, but really the stick controls are quite bad. What really made Halo stand out was its implementation of what would be the modern aim assists. So the first of which is bullet magnetism. So wow, okay, well, that guy's got a groove. So bullet magnetism, if your reticle's red like this, when you fire your weapon, it'll veer the bullet towards the target, and the reticle size is a relative gauge of how far it'll bend. This was used in other games, however, scaled down. Halo's version is scaled down compared to previous games. The other two aim assist types would be most commonly used in other games, and that is slowdown. So when your cursor passes over a target, it will slow down, and you can kind of see that happen with it snagging on these targets. And tracking or adhesion. So when you're strafing around a target, your camera will automatically rotate to try to follow them within a certain range. I'm very far from this target, so it might be too subtle to notice, but it is occurring. A way to maybe demonstrate that a bit better is that aim assist actually doesn't trigger unless one or both of the sticks are active. So if I don't move the sticks at all and jump, there's no aim assist right now, so you can see the cursor or crosshair is clearing the jackal. But if I move and jump, you can see that the vertical displacement is heavily restrained, and that's because it's trying to stay on target. And you can see this with the right stick as well. As long as it's moving, aim assist is triggering. And this is actually part why players who've played, say, either Master Chief Collection or Halo Infinite with dead zone options there, if you set the dead zone options to 0%, basically the sticks are always moving, and so it feels like you have more aim assist, even though it's actually the same amount. It's just easier to move, so it's easier to trigger. Now, that about covers things. So, yeah, thanks for watching, and everyone, have a good rest of your day.